Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar on WebMI Plus with Canvas. It's a straightforward enough 15 minutes presentation. If you have any questions, we can get to those at the end.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Today we will be looking at Canvas WebMI Plus in Cscape 10. Let's look at our agenda for today. We will start with a quick review of WebMI. Then we will discuss the enhancements made for WebMI Plus for Canvas in Cscape 10, as well as what has stayed the same as with standard WebMI. Finally, we will go through the configuration for WebMI Plus in Cscape 10. There will be demonstrations throughout, and we will finish with the Q&A session. WebMI is the capability for the Horner OCS product lines to serve over web pages over Ethernet from its local memory slot, which is usually done using microSD. The web pages are typically used for remote monitoring and can also be used for control if the system designer chooses. These web pages are created within Cscape, and they are based on HTML5, which makes them highly compatible with nearly all web browsers on mobile devices, computers, and other devices. Some WebMI applications include monitoring machinery and equipment in a factory setting for operational purposes, accessing data from machinery and equipment for preventative maintenance and production efficiency programs, as well as monitoring and controlling equipment and processes in a campus environment, or an environment where you may have equipment that's scattered throughout an area, such as an agricultural site. If you wanted to use WebMI within a facility, then you would simply use standard IT security methods to secure the system, because you would only have access to WebMI through the local factory LAN. So whatever security has been applied to the local factory LAN will also protect the WebMI. The WebMI username and password credentials would then be assigned to whoever will be using WebMI with the system, and would allow them to log in from nearly any web browser, from a mobile device or a computer system such as Windows, Mac, or Linux. If you want to use WebMI from outside a facility, then there are multiple options that you can use for security. For example, you could have IT managed access through the firewall using standard VPNs. There are also several dedicated gateways or cell modems that could be tied to specific OCS controllers. From a gateway standpoint, there are manufacturers such as Secomia, MB Connect, E1, and Tozzybox. Then for cell modems, which often have built-in routers included, you have options such as Multitech, Digi, 6net, and Phoenix. Now we will look at WebMI Plus. This is an enhanced version of WebMI that is standard on Canvas controllers. The basics of WebMI functionality have stayed the same. However, there have also been a number of requested enhancements implemented for WebMI Plus. First, we will discuss what has stayed the same for WebMI Plus. For one, WebMI Plus screens can be duplicates of the OCS screens. WebMI Plus screens can be duplicates of the OCS screens. So whatever's running on your OCS screen can be duplicated and used as your WebMI Plus screen if you choose. You can also create unique web pages using the Web Designer feature in Cscape, so that the screens being viewed remotely using WebMI Plus do not exactly match what's on the OCS. For example, if you have a preventative maintenance program or a production control department that are remotely logging into the equipment, and what they're interested in is different to what the operator needs to see, you could create custom web pages using the Web Designer feature in Cscape to provide that information from the same piece of equipment, customized for anyone that isn't the operator. If you decide to have your WebMI Plus screens as exact duplicates of what's running on the OCS screen, then you can choose to make the WebMI screens and the operator screens synchronized. So when the operator changes screens on the OCS, the WebMI Plus screens will also change, and vice versa. From a login credential standpoint, WebMI Plus also uses the user access feature for its credentials. The connection timeouts and the session timeout are also effectively the same for WebMI and WebMI Plus. Next, we will look at the enhancements implemented. WebMI Plus has been rewritten from the ground up to be more efficient. One of the ways this has been done is with WebMI Plus web pages, as they are now transferred online or over Ethernet from the OCS to the web browser at login. These web pages reside on the browser after the upload, improving communication and time efficiency. The WebMI Plus web pages don't have to be hosted on the OCS from microSD. They can now also be hosted from internal memory. You can also completely eliminate the user login using WebMI Plus if you choose, or you can fully customize the user login if you decide to keep it. This also applies to the terms and conditions of the login. Finally, object support for WebMI Plus is significantly better. More objects are supported, and the user interface appearance better matches the object as it would appear on the OCS. From a Cscape configuration standpoint, we will note that there isn't any licensing configuration required with Canvas and WebMI Plus because Canvas supports WebMI Plus as standard, so it can be considered as pre-licensed. The main configuration for WebMI Plus is performed in the User Interface tab under Options. Once again, the user login is highly configurable, and the timing parameters and the HTTPS configuration, which is available with WebMI Plus, is available through the Advanced button. With the user login configuration dialog, you have the option to disable it completely, as well as the option to import custom images, such as a company logo for the OCS that is being deployed on the machine. You also have complete flexibility to modify the login configuration and the ability to completely customize the terms and conditions. If you choose to keep your login credentials, then you also have many options to configure these. These credentials are performed from the User Interface tab under Systems and User as highlighted. Unlike standard WebMI, WebMI Plus allows user credentials which have been assigned as variables or assigned to variables to be edited at runtime. So with standard WebMI, all user credentials have to be hard-coded in Cscape, but with WebMI Plus, you can instead choose to use variables for usernames and passwords. However, before you can log in remotely using a set of user credentials, that set of user credentials has to have been logged in locally ahead of time. So once that's happened on the OCS, then the user can log in either locally or remotely using those credentials that were assigned using a variable. Now we will demonstrate WebMI Plus with Canvas in Cscape 10. We have a demo project we created open, completed with several screens and logic. First, to find the information on WebMI, we will go to the User Interface tab in the ribbon toolbar, where we have a WebMI group with several different features. We will start by selecting Options. At the top of this dialog box, we have the banner for the web page name that will appear in your web browser. This will typically be a company's name or the name of the machine being used. In addition to the banner that shows up at the top of the web browser, when WebMI first loads on the browser, a logo will be displayed, and the user has the ability to pick that particular image for this. We will choose the Horner APG logo for this. Next, we have the timeout parameters for session timeouts and connection timeouts. This is how long within activity we want to wait before you automatically log out any users. We will leave these at the default settings for now. If we want to completely prevent sessions from ending due to inactivity, we can select this checkbox here, which will inhibit session timeouts. We also have a status we can assign here, which is 80 bytes long, as well as some information on the status structure, which tells us what users are logged in at any given moment. Then the Enable Screen Sync settings enables you to have the screen displayed in WebMI and the screen displayed by the user on the OCS to be synchronized. So if you're actively monitoring the unit over WebMI and you change screens locally, that screen will also change for the operator, and vice versa. If you want the screens to act independently, then you can leave Enable Screen Sync off. So far, the configuration settings here are very similar to what was available with standard WebMI, with the exception of the ability to select an image when WebMI starts up on the web browser. Next, we will look at the user login. Once again, with WebMI Plus, you have the ability to completely disable the user login if you choose. So when the IP address of the OCS is called up on a browser, you can choose to have that web page automatically load without any kind of login. If you want to keep the user login, then you still have a lot of flexibility in terms of how you configure the login box. For example, you can configure a legend for the login box, as well as configure the colors and size, and add an image for your company logo. For our demonstration, we will choose to disable the login page. As well as the user login configuration, there are now a lot more options to customize the terms and conditions. Most users, when they first log in, have to accept terms and conditions before they start using WebMI from their web browser. And if you select the first option here, then this will still happen. However, if you do not want the user to have to accept the terms and conditions every time they log in, you can select the second option instead, and then you can choose to accept the Horner terms and conditions on their behalf. If you want the user to accept your own custom terms and conditions, you can select the third option. Then you would accept the Horner terms and conditions, and then add the name of the file for your custom terms and conditions. So this is our user login configuration. Next, we will look at the user credential settings, which can be found in the Systems group of the User Interface tab. This is where we can hardcode users if we choose, or we could add in variable arrays here instead. So once we've made the changes that we want to make to our screens and our user logins, then we can publish our web pages to the OCS. We can do this from the WebMI section group by selecting Publish to Removable Media. One option that has always been available here is that you can publish to your computer and then manually copy the files over, or you can publish to OCS. If you choose to publish to OCS, then it will use FTP to download these files to the OCS. However, with Cscape 10, the OCS itself doesn't have to have FTP credentials configured in order to download it. So if you're doing the WebMI download from Cscape, then you only need the IP address of the OCS that you are downloading to. We will note that the final part of the WebMI download with both Cscape 10 and earlier versions usually takes a while to finish, as the status bar on the screen can appear to be frozen here. Now let's look at our bench setup for this demonstration. On our OCS, we have a collection of demo screens that we have created, such as this I/O simulator screen where we can change inputs from our I/O simulator. Some of the inputs also cause alarms to be generated, as we can see here. Then we can also view the current alarms and acknowledge them, as well as access our alarm history, which tells us everything that has happened with our alarms in general. From here, we can also adjust our analog values on our I/O simulator and watch the meters change accordingly, as well as adjust the frequency of the flashing lights here in terms of hertz. So this is our first screen. We will switch to our second screen, which is a conveyor belt simulator. From here, we can load cartons onto the conveyor belt, which causes this animation of a box moving across the screen. We can also change the speed that the object is moving across the conveyor belt. We also have 4 different trend graphs. First, we have a scope graph, which has a quick update rate of about every 50 milliseconds. Then we have the trend object, which is only updating or sampling once per second. We also have a multi-point graph, as well as a scatter graph. Now we will look at our remote WebMI. From our web browser, we will enter the IP address of our OCS into the search engine. Once we do this, the Horner logo we set in our configuration appears on the startup screen, as well as text that says downloading/compiling. This is a fundamental difference in how WebMI works. Here the web browser was receiving the web pages from the OCS, and now those web pages reside in the web browser. And now we are exchanging data between the web browser and the OCS in real time, which might result in some changes in operation. First, we will look at our I/O status screen. As we can see, this screen looks very similar to the I/O status screen shown on our OCS. We can still change our inputs and outputs, and as the inputs change, we can see their status change, and we still have our alarms triggered on the screen. We also have our alarm object, which allows us to view our list of current alarms and remotely acknowledge any alarms. We can also look at our alarm history. As our analog I/O is changing, we are adjusting these dials a little bit, and as we can see, the needles change accordingly. So we can operate this WebMI screen very similarly to our OCS screen. Now let's look at the scope object. If we look at our bench setup, this is what our scope graph currently looks like, with data being graphed and moving across the screen. Now let's switch back to our WebMI screen of our scope graph. We will note that it only starts to graph data once we switch to this screen. This scope object is sampling data every 50 to 100 milliseconds, but still graphs a reasonable amount of data. Also with the scope graph, the graph will only sample data until the screen is full and does not scroll across. Next, we will look at our standard trend graph. Once again, when we look at the graph on our OCS, we have data moving across the screen. Now let's look at our graph in WebMI. As we can see, we don't have historical data here, and our graph slowly starts to trend once we switch to this screen. So once again, there is some trend capability built into WebMI, however this does not cover historical data at this stage. Next, we will return to the home page again and select our WebMI multi-point graph. Only once we select the graph button, our graph starts to trend. This also applies to our scatter graph. Our graph only starts to trend once we select the graph button. So from this demonstration, we can see that there are some limitations in historical trending with WebMI Plus. However, many of its other functions are full-featured. That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you so much for listening, and the Q&A session will begin shortly.
Okay, so next week we just have a comparison video for the micro OCSs against the XL Prime, all the differences that you see on both, and again the following week with Prime against Canvas. I'm not seeing any questions in on this. It's much the same as it always has been with WebMI. Okay, on that note, thank you all for joining, and I will see you again soon.